David Martinez never believed in aliens. He thought people who claimed to see UFOs were either lying or had too much to drink. As a paramedic working nights in rural Nevada, he had seen plenty of weird things, but nothing that couldn't be explained by science or common sense. It was a Tuesday night in October 2019. David had just finished a 12-hour shift at the local hospital. He was tired, his back ached from lifting patients all day, and all he wanted was to get home to his small apartment and sleep. The digital clock on his truck dashboard glowed 3:47 a.m. as he drove down Highway 375, the same route he had taken hundreds of times before. The road was empty, as it usually was at this hour. Nothing but desert on both sides, with scattered Joshua trees casting strange shadows in his headlights. David had his radio playing softly, some old country song that reminded him of his childhood in Texas. He was thinking about his day off, tomorrow, maybe finally fixing that leaky faucet in his kitchen. Then he saw something that made him slow down. At first, it looked like a car accident. There was something metallic glinting in the desert, maybe 50 yards off the highway. David's training kicked in immediately. He had responded to countless crashes over the years, and he knew that every second counted when someone was injured. He pulled his truck to the side of the road and grabbed his emergency medical kit from the back seat. As he walked toward what he thought was a crashed car, David noticed how quiet everything was. The desert was always quiet at night, but this felt different. Even the usual sounds of insects and small animals were missing. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. The closer he got, the more confused he became. This wasn't any car he had ever seen. It was made of some kind of metal that seemed to shimmer and change color in his flashlight beam. The shape was all wrong too, more like a smooth oval than anything with wheels. Steam, or some kind of vapor, was rising from its surface, and David could hear a low humming sound, almost musical. His first thought was that it might be some kind of military aircraft. Nevada had plenty of secret government facilities, and maybe something had crashed during a test flight. But as he circled around the strange object, David realized this wasn't built by any government he knew about. The metal was too smooth, too perfect. There were no visible seams or bolts or anything that looked like normal construction. That's when he saw her about 20 feet from the crashed object. A figure was lying on the sandy ground. David's medical instincts took over, and he rushed forward without thinking about the strangeness of the situation. Someone was hurt, and that was all that mattered. But when he knelt down beside the injured person, David's world turned upside down. She looked human at first glance, but the differences were impossible to miss. Her skin was pale, almost white, but it seemed to glow slightly in the darkness. She was tall, probably close to 7 feet, with long limbs and delicate features. Her hair was silver, not gray like an old person's, but actually metallic silver. And her eyes, when they fluttered open and looked at him, were larger than any human eyes he had ever seen. David's hand shook as he reached for his medical bag. His brain was trying to process what he was seeing, but it didn't make sense. This couldn't be real. People didn't just find aliens crashed in the Nevada desert. Things like this happened in movies. Not to tired paramedics driving home from work, but the woman was clearly in pain. Dark fluid, unlike any blood David had seen, was seeping from a long gash on her left arm. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Classic signs of shock and blood loss. Whatever she was, wherever she came from, she needed medical attention. The woman's large eyes focused on David's face, and he felt something he had never experienced before. It was like she was looking directly into his soul, seeing every thought and fear he had ever had. But instead of feeling invaded, David felt a strange sense of calm. Her eyes weren't threatening or alien in a scary way. They were intelligent, curious, and most importantly, grateful. She tried to speak, and her voice was unlike anything David had ever heard. It was musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, but he couldn't understand a single word. The language was completely foreign, not like any Earth language he knew. But her tone was clear enough. She was asking for help. David looked around. The desert, half expecting to see government agents or men in black suits coming to arrest him. But they were completely alone under the star-filled sky. His truck sat on the highway, emergency lights blinking, the only sign of civilization for miles. He made a decision that would change his life forever. Taking a deep breath, David opened his medical kit and began to assess the woman's injuries. Whatever she was, wherever she came from, she was a living being in need of help, and David had sworn an oath to help anyone who was hurt, no matter who they were. As he worked, checking her pulse and examining the wound on her arm, David couldn't help but marvel at how similar she was to humans. Her heart was beating, though maybe a bit slower than normal. She had warm blood flowing through her veins, even if it was darker than human blood. Her bones seemed to be in the same places, and her muscles responded the same way. The woman watched him work with those amazing eyes, and David could swear he saw amazement in her expression. Not just gratitude for his help, but genuine surprise that he was helping her at all. It was as if she hadn't expected a human to be brave enough or kind enough to touch her. That look in her eyes told David everything he needed to know. Whatever differences existed between their species, whatever vast distances separated their worlds, in this moment they were just two beings, one helping the other. And that was something David could understand. Something that made sense in a situation where nothing else did. The desert wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something otherworldly. David continued to work, his hands steady now, focused on the task that had become the most important thing he had ever done. David stared down at the injured woman, his mind racing faster than his heart. Every logical part of his brain was screaming at him to call for backup, to report this to the authorities, to get as far away from this situation as possible. But his hands remained steady as he held his medical kit, and his eyes stayed locked on hers. She was watching him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, like she could read his thoughts. Her large, luminous eyes seemed to plead with him, but not just for medical help. There was something deeper there, a kind of desperation that went beyond physical pain. She was asking him to trust her, and more importantly, she was trusting him. David's phone was in his pocket. He could call his supervisor, or maybe even 911, though he had no idea how he would explain this situation. Hey, I found a crashed UFO. With an injured alien woman wasn't exactly covered in the emergency response manual. But as he reached for his phone, the woman made a sound that stopped him cold. It wasn't quite a word, more like a musical note filled with emotion. She slowly lifted her uninjured arm and placed her hand over his, gently pushing the phone back down. Her skin felt warm, but different, smoother than human skin, with a texture that reminded him of silk. When she touched him, David felt a strange, tingling sensation, not unpleasant, but definitely not normal. Her message was clear without words. She didn't want him to call anyone else. She didn't want other people to know about her. The fear in her eyes was real and deep, and David suddenly understood that she wasn't just afraid of her injuries. She was afraid of what humans might do to her if they found her. David had always considered himself a practical man. He followed procedures, filled out paperwork correctly, and never took unnecessary risks. But sitting in the Nevada desert at 4 a.m, looking into the eyes of a being from another world, he realized that sometimes the right thing to do had nothing to do with procedures. The woman's breathing was getting more labored. The dark fluid from her wound was spreading across the sand, and David could see that she was getting weaker. Whatever internal debate he was having with himself, it needed to end quickly. She was dying, and he was the only person who could help her. He made his choice. Okay, he said softly, more to himself than to her. Okay, I'll help you, but you have to let me work. David opened his medical kit and began laying out supplies on a clean towel. He had treated hundreds of patients over the years, but never under conditions like these. No hospital, no backup, no equipment except what he carried in his truck, and certainly no experience with alien anatomy. As he worked, David kept talking to her in a low, calm voice. It was something he did with all his patients, especially the scared ones. Even though she couldn't understand his words, His tone seemed to comfort her. Her breathing slowed slightly, and some of the tension left her body. "I've been a paramedic for 8 years," he told her as he cleaned his hands with sanitizer. "I've seen all kinds of injuries, car accidents, falls, heart attacks. Never treated anyone from another planet, but I guess there's a first time for everything." The woman made another one of those musical sounds, and David could swear it sounded like she was trying to laugh, even in pain. Even scared and far from home, she seemed to find something amusing about his nervous chatter. That small moment of connection gave David the confidence he needed. He examined her wound more carefully, using his flashlight to get a better look. The cut was deep but clean, probably from some kind of metal debris when her ship crashed. The edges were straight, which was good news. It would be easier to close properly. But the fluid leaking from the wound was definitely not human blood. It was darker, almost purple, and it seemed to shimmer slightly in the light. David had no idea if human medical supplies would work on her, but he had to try. He pulled out a bottle of antiseptic and showed it to her first, making cleaning motions so she would understand what he was about to do. She nodded, a gesture that was surprisingly human, and braced herself. When the antiseptic touched her wound, she flinched but didn't cry out. David watched her face carefully, looking for signs that he was hurting her or making things worse. Her expression showed pain, but also determination. She was being as brave as any patient he had ever treated. "You're tough," David said admiringly. "Tougher than most of the people I work on. They usually complain a lot more than you do." As he continued cleaning the wound, David found himself studying her more closely. Her bone structure was similar to humans, but more delicate. Almost bird-like in its lightness, her skin had that strange glow, but up close he could see it wasn't really glowing. It was more like it was reflecting light in an unusual way, like it had tiny crystals embedded in it. Her hair was definitely metallic, not just silver-colored, but actually made of something that looked like thin metal fibers. When the desert wind moved it, it caught the light like spun platinum. David had never seen anything so beautiful or so alien. The most amazing thing was her eyes. They were easily twice the size of human eyes, with pupils that seemed to adjust to light much faster than his did. When she looked at him, David felt like she was seeing not just his face, but his intentions, his character, maybe even his soul. It should have been frightening, but instead it was oddly comforting. As David worked, he became aware that she was studying him just as intently as he was studying her. She seemed fascinated by his hands, watching every movement as he prepared to stitch her wound closed. When he accidentally dropped a piece of gauze and she caught it with reflexes that were impossibly fast, David realized that she was probably just as curious about him as he was about her. "I bet you've never seen a human up close before," he said, continuing his one-sided conversation. "We probably look as weird to you as you do to us. Though I have to say, you're a lot more beautiful than the aliens in the movies." The woman tilted her head at that, and David could swear she understood something in his tone. Even if not his words, her large eyes seemed to study his face more intently, and David felt himself blushing under her gaze. This was definitely not how he had expected his Tuesday night to go. But as he prepared to begin the most important medical procedure of his career, David realized that sometimes the most extraordinary moments came from the simplest decision to help someone in need, no matter how different they might be. David's hands had stopped shaking as he prepared to touch the alien woman's wound. He felt that familiar calm that always came over him during medical emergencies. This was what he was trained for, what he was good at, even if the patient was unlike any he had ever treated before. He started by gently probing around the edges of the cut with a clean cloth, trying to understand how deep it went and whether there might be any foreign objects inside. The woman watched his every movement with those incredible eyes, and David could feel her trust in him growing stronger. She didn't flinch away when he touched her. Even though he was a complete stranger from another species, her skin felt amazing. Under his fingers, it was warm, definitely warmer than human skin, and it had a texture that was completely unique, smooth like silk, but somehow more substantial, like it was made of something stronger than regular skin. David found himself wondering what kind of world she came from. What conditions had shaped her people to develop skin like this? The dark fluid from her wound had an unusual quality to it, unlike human blood, which would have started clotting. By now, this seemed to flow more slowly, almost like it was thinking about where to go. Under his flashlight, it actually seemed to shimmer with tiny sparkles of light, like someone had mixed glitter into it. This might sting a little, David warned her, holding up a bottle of antiseptic. Even though she couldn't understand his words, he wanted to prepare her for what was coming. Medical procedures were scary enough when you knew what was happening. He couldn't imagine how frightening this must be for her. When the antiseptic touched her wound, the woman made a soft sound that was definitely pain, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she seemed to focus on David's face, like she was drawing strength from his calm expression. He had seen this before with human patients, how they would watch his face for signs of worry or panic, and adjust their own fear level accordingly. "You're doing great," David told her softly. "Much better than most people. Last week I had a guy who needed 3 stitches in his hand, and he screamed so loud that half the hospital came running." As David continued cleaning the wound, he noticed something strange happening. The area around the cut was starting to look different, healthier somehow. The edges of the wound seemed to be pulling together slightly on their own, as if her body was trying to heal itself much faster than a human body could. This was both good news and bad news. Good because it meant she might recover faster than he expected. Bad because it meant he needed to work quickly before her alien healing process made it impossible to stitch the wound properly. David had sewn up hundreds of cuts in his career, but he had never been more careful with his stitching than he was that night. Each stitch needed to be perfect, placed exactly right to help her healing process instead of interfering with it. He worked slowly, methodically, talking to her the whole time to keep them both calm. "I became a paramedic because I wanted to help people," he found himself saying as he worked. "My dad was a mechanic, and he wanted me to follow in his footsteps. But I was always more interested in fixing people than fixing cars. People are more complicated, but they're also more rewarding when you get it right." The woman seemed to be listening intently to his voice, even though she couldn't understand the words. David had the strange feeling that she was learning about him, not just from what he was doing, but from how he was doing it. Every careful movement of his hands, every gentle word, was telling her something about what kind of person he was. Halfway through the stitching process, something unexpected happened. David's suture needle slipped slightly, and he accidentally pricked his own finger. A single drop of his blood fell onto the woman's arm, landing right next to where he had been working. The moment David's blood touched her skin, something incredible happened. The area around the drop began to glow with a soft, warm light, not bright or scary, just a gentle luminescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with both their heartbeats. The woman's eyes widened in what David could only describe as amazement. She stared at the glowing spot on her arm, then looked up at David with an expression that was completely different from before. The fear was gone, replaced by something that looked like wonder, like she had just witnessed something miraculous. She reached out with her good hand and gently touched David's pricked finger, examining the small drop of blood there. When she touched him, David felt that same warm tingling sensation he had experienced before, but stronger this time. For just a moment, he could swear he felt what she was feeling, a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite identify. It was like she was amazed not just by what had happened, but by the fact that he had been willing to help her in the first place. "Did I do something wrong?" David asked, worried that maybe human blood was somehow harmful to her. But the woman shook her head, another surprisingly human gesture, and made one of her musical sounds that definitely sounded positive. She pointed to the glowing spot, then to David, then back to the spot. She seemed to be trying to tell him something important, something about the significance of what had just happened. David didn't understand the science of it, but he could see that this wasn't something bad. If anything, she seemed healthier, stronger, like his blood had somehow given her energy. David finished his stitching work with extra care, placing each remaining stitch perfectly. The woman's wound was now closed properly, and the bleeding had stopped completely. He cleaned the area one more time and began preparing to bandage it. Using supplies from his medical kit. As he wrapped the bandage around her arm, David couldn't help but notice how the woman was still staring at him with that look of amazement. It was like she had never expected a human to be capable of what he had just done. Not just the medical skill, but the willingness to help someone so different from himself. "There," David said as he finished securing the bandage. "That should hold everything together while you heal. Try not to move that arm too much for the next few days." The woman flexed her arm carefully, testing the bandage and the stitches underneath. David watched nervously, hoping his work would hold. When she moved her arm without any signs of pain or problems, he felt a surge of professional pride. He had just successfully performed surgery on an alien, and it had worked. But more than that, he had done something that seemed to have touched her in a way that went beyond medical treatment. The way she looked at him now, the way she held herself, everything about her demeanor had changed. She wasn't just grateful for his help. She was impressed by his courage, amazed by his willingness to reach across the vast gap between their species and touch her with healing hands. David began packing up his medical supplies, but he could feel the woman's eyes on him the whole time. This encounter was far from over, and he had the feeling that the most important part was just beginning. David finished packing his medical supplies, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. The alien woman was sitting up now, testing her bandaged arm with careful movements. The immediate medical emergency was over, but something deeper was happening. Between them, something that neither of them seemed ready to end. She looked at David with those incredible eyes and slowly began to stand up. David had guessed she was tall, but seeing her at full height was still shocking. She had to be nearly 7 feet tall, but she moved with a grace that made her height seem natural, like she belonged to a species that had evolved in low gravity or wide open spaces. Despite her size, there was nothing threatening about her. If anything, she seemed gentle, almost fragile in a way that had nothing to do with her injury. David got the impression that she was as amazed by him as he was by her, like neither of them had expected this kind of peaceful encounter between their species. She looked down at her bandaged arm, then back at David. Her expression was so full of gratitude that it made David feel embarrassed. He wasn't used to patients looking at him like he had just performed a miracle. Usually, people thanked him and moved on with their lives, but this felt different, more significant somehow. The woman raised her good hand and placed it over her heart, then pointed to David. The gesture was so human, so universally understood, that David felt tears forming in his eyes. She was thanking him, not just with words or sounds, but with her whole being. Then she did something that surprised him even more. She reached out and gently took David's hand in both of hers. Her skin was warm and soft, and David could feel that same tingling sensation he had experienced before, but this time it was stronger, like a gentle electric current flowing between them. As she held his hand, David began to feel something incredible. It started as warmth in his chest, then spread throughout his body. But it wasn't just physical warmth, it was emotional warmth, a feeling of peace and acceptance unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was like she was sharing her feelings with him directly, without words or sounds or any normal form of communication. In that moment, David understood that she wasn't just grateful for his medical help, she was amazed by his courage, by his willingness to help a complete stranger from another world. In her culture, apparently, this kind of bravery was rare and precious, even among her own people. Images began to flash through David's mind, though he wasn't sure if he was imagining them or if she was somehow showing them to him. He saw glimpses of her world, a place of incredible beauty with crystal cities that seemed to grow from the ground like plants. The sky was a different color, more purple than blue, with 2 suns casting rainbow shadows across the landscape. He saw her people, tall and graceful like her, living in harmony with their environment. They seemed peaceful, almost shy, like they preferred to observe the universe rather than conquer it. David got the impression that they were explorers and scientists, not warriors or invaders. Most importantly, he saw how rare it was for them to interact with other species. They were cautious, by nature, preferring to watch from a distance rather than make contact. The fact that she had crashed on Earth was clearly an accident, something that had forced her into a situation she never would have chosen. But now, holding David's hand and feeling his compassion, she seemed to realize that not all contact with other species had to be fearful or dangerous. Sometimes it could be beautiful, meaningful, even healing in ways that went beyond physical medicine. David felt tears running down his cheeks. Though he wasn't sure why he was crying, the emotions flowing between them were too complex for his mind to fully understand: joy, sadness, wonder, gratitude, and something else that might have been love, but not romantic love. Something deeper and more universal, like the love between all living beings who choose kindness over fear. The woman noticed his tears and gently touched his face with her free hand. Her touch was incredibly gentle, like she was handling something precious and fragile. When her fingers came away wet with his tears, she looked at the moisture with fascination, as if she had never seen anything like it before. She brought her fingers to her own eyes, and David watched in amazement as her eyes began to shimmer with what looked like tears of her own, though they seemed to glow slightly in the darkness. She was learning from him, copying his emotional response, and somehow making it her own. They stood there in the desert for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, connected in a way that transcended language or species. David felt like he was experiencing something that changed him on a fundamental level, something that would affect how he saw the world and his place in it for the rest of his life. Finally, the woman released his hand and stepped back slightly. She looked toward her damaged ship, and David could see sadness in her expression. She knew she had to leave, had to return to whatever world she had come from. But she also seemed reluctant to break this connection they had formed. She walked over to her ship and disappeared inside for a few moments. David waited, not sure what was happening, but somehow knowing that this wasn't goodbye yet. When she emerged, she was carrying something small in her hand. It was about the size of a marble, but it seemed to contain entire galaxies within its crystal structure. Swirling lights moved through it like tiny stars being born and dying in. Fast forward, it was the most beautiful thing David had ever seen, and possibly the most valuable object on Earth. She pressed it into David's palm and closed his fingers around it. The moment it touched his skin, David felt a surge of warmth and energy. He somehow understood that this wasn't just a gift or a memento. It was a communication device, a way for her to stay connected to him across the vast distances of space. More than that, it was a symbol of the bond they had formed. Proof that compassion and courage could bridge any gap, even the one between worlds. David looked up at her, wanting to say something meaningful, something worthy of this moment. But all he could manage was a simple thank you. She seemed to understand, though. Her musical voice spoke a few words in her own language, and even though David couldn't understand them, he knew they meant something like thank you as well. Thank you for your courage, for your kindness, for showing me that the universe is full of beings worth knowing. As they stood together in the pre-dawn darkness, David realized that this encounter had changed both of them forever. He had learned that the universe was far more wonderful and mysterious than he had ever imagined. And she had learned that sometimes, when you're lost and hurt and far from home, a stranger's kindness can be the most powerful force in the universe. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the first hints of dawn, when the alien woman looked up at the sky and made a sound that David somehow understood. Meant it was time for her to leave. The reality hit him like a physical blow. In a few minutes, she would be gone, and he would be alone in the desert with nothing but memories and a crystal to prove that this had really happened. She walked slowly around her damaged ship, running her hands along its surface. David could see that the crash had hurt the vehicle, but apparently not beyond repair. Panels that had seemed broken were somehow pulling themselves back into shape, and the strange humming sound was getting stronger, more musical. The woman spent several minutes examining the bandage work David had done on her arm. She touched it gently, carefully, like she was memorizing every detail. David had the strange feeling that she was treating his medical work like a piece of art, something precious that deserved to be studied and remembered. She looked back at David one more time, and he saw something in her expression that looked almost like regret. Not regret about meeting him, but regret about having to leave so soon. If circumstances had been different, David thought, maybe they could have learned so much more from each other. But circumstances weren't different. She had to return to her own world, her own people. And David had to figure out how to go back to his normal life after experiencing something that would change him forever. The woman approached her ship, and David watched in fascination as an opening appeared in what had seemed like a solid metal surface. It didn't open like a door or a hatch. Instead, the metal seemed to become liquid for a moment, creating a passage just large enough for her to enter. She stepped inside, turned to look at David one last time, and the opening sealed itself seamlessly behind her. David stood alone in the desert, holding the crystal she had given him, and watching her ship prepare for departure. The humming sound grew louder, more complex, like an orchestra tuning their instruments. The damaged areas of the ship were continuing to repair themselves, and the whole vehicle was beginning to glow with that same soft light he had seen when his blood touched her skin. Then, slowly and silently, the ship began to rise from the ground. There was no roar of engines, no blast of hot air, no dramatic special effects like in the movies. It simply lifted into the air as if gravity had stopped applying to it. David watched it climb higher and higher until it was just a bright spot against the stars, and then it was gone. David stood there for a long time after the ship disappeared, staring at the empty sky and trying to process what had just happened to him. The crystal in his hand was warm and seemed to pulse gently, like a second heartbeat. When he looked closely at it, the swirling lights inside seemed to respond to his attention, glowing brighter and moving faster. Finally, as the sun began to rise over the desert mountains, David walked back to his truck. The drive home was surreal. Everything looked exactly the same as it had a few hours earlier. But David felt like he was seeing the world through completely different eyes. Every star in the fading night sky might hide worlds full of beings like her. Every patch of empty desert might have witnessed encounters like theirs. When David got home, he sat on his couch and stared at the crystal for hours. In daylight, it looked even more incredible, like someone had captured a piece of the universe and shrunk it down to fit in his palm. But more than its beauty, what amazed him was what it represented. Proof that the universe was full of wonders he had never imagined, and that sometimes those wonders reached out to touch ordinary people like him. Over the next few weeks, David struggled with what to do about his experience. Part of him wanted to tell someone, to share this incredible story with the world. But every time he thought about it, he remembered the fear in her eyes when she had pushed his phone away. She hadn't wanted other people to know about her. She had trusted him to keep her secret. And David wasn't about to break that trust. He went back to work as usual, responding to medical emergencies and helping people in crisis. But everything felt different now. Every patient he treated reminded him that compassion was a universal language, that the impulse to help someone in pain existed across all species and all worlds. The crystal remained his constant companion. He carried it with him everywhere, though he kept it hidden from others. Sometimes, late at night, he would hold it and think about her, wondering if she had made it home safely, if her arm had healed properly, if she ever thought about the human paramedic who had helped her in the Nevada desert. 6 months after that incredible night, David got a call that made his heart race. There had been reports of strange lights in the same area where he had found her. When he arrived at the scene with his ambulance crew, he found nothing unusual, just some disturbed sand and a few confused witnesses who claimed to have seen something impossible. But after his colleagues left, David walked out into the desert alone. There, half buried in the sand near the spot where her ship had crashed, he found something that made him gasp: his original bandages, the ones he had used to wrap her wound. were sitting on top of the sand like someone had carefully placed them. There, they looked exactly as they had when he had first applied them, somehow perfectly preserved despite months of desert weather. Next to the bandages was something that made David's hands shake as he picked it up. It was a small piece of metal, clearly not from Earth, carved with symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The symbols were beautiful and completely alien, but somehow David understood their meaning. They said thank you and remember me and friendship across the stars. David realized that she had come back, probably to check on the place where they had first met, or maybe to leave him another message. The thought that she had returned, that she had been thinking about him, filled David with a joy that was almost overwhelming. He kept both the preserved bandages and the metal artifact with his crystal, his 3 pieces of proof that the most important night of his life had really happened. Sometimes people asked him why he seemed different, why he had become more patient with difficult patients, more willing to go the extra mile to help someone in need. David never told them the real reason. He never explained that he had learned compassion from a being who had traveled across the galaxy, that he had discovered courage by touching the wound of someone from another world. Instead, he just smiled and continued his work, carrying the secret knowledge that the universe was vast and wonderful and full of beings who, despite all their differences, shared the same capacity for kindness and gratitude. Years passed, and David never saw her again. But he never forgot her, and he never stopped believing that somewhere among the stars, she remembered him too. The crystal continued to pulse gently in his pocket, a reminder that some connections transcend distance, time, and species. And sometimes, late at night when he was driving the empty desert highways, David would look up at the stars and wonder if she was looking back.